Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today as we continue this year's webinar series. Although many of you that are with us today are familiar with the work NACOLE does throughout the year, for those of you who are not, NACOLE is an organization that for the last 26 years has worked to create a community for support of independent civilian oversight entities that seek to make their local law enforcement agencies, jails, and prisons more transparent, accountable, and responsive to the communities they serve. For more information about NACOLE, training opportunities, and resources, please visit our website at nacole.org. Before we begin today's webinar, I would like to remind all of you that you have entered today's call in listen-only mode. During the session, however, you will have the ability to type in questions you have. I will then be able to pose those questions to Mr. Moss towards the end of the session. I would like to also remind you that today's meeting is being recorded and will be made available at a later date. Lastly, I would like to thank Jason Wechter, a past board member and current member of the NACOLE Training, Education, and Standards Committee, who put today's session together, where we will discuss civilian oversight of police surveillance technologies. And with that, I will hand things over to Jason to introduce today's speaker. Jason?
Thank you, Cami. So our speaker today, Dave Moss, is Director of Investigations at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, a San Francisco-based nonprofit that advocates for civil liberties in an age of advancing technology. Dave focuses on the intersection of technology and the criminal justice system, from police databases and surveillance to the use of social media by incarcerated people. Through a partnership with the Reynolds School of Journalism at the University of Nevada, Reno, Dave leads the Atlas of Surveillance project, which aims to document and map which technologies are in use by law enforcement agencies around the country. Prior to joining EFF, Dave was an investigative reporter for alternative news across the American Southwest. In 2014, he was a recipient of NACOLE's Contribution to Oversight Award.
All right, I guess that's my cue, huh?
Yes, it is, Dave. Thank you.
All right, let us just sort of confirm that you can see what I'm doing here. Is my slides showing?
Yes, we can see them.
Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and jump into it. So as Jason mentioned, I'm going to be talking about civilian oversight of police technology. I tend to talk a little bit fast, so I'm going to try to slow myself down a little bit as we go along. But it is because I'm very excited to talk about this. I very much care about NACOLE's mission, and one of the reasons I do the work I do is in order to inform people who can actually do something about it, and that's you. So as mentioned, EFF was formed in 1990 to ensure that our rights and freedoms are enhanced and protected as our use of technology grows. That means we champion privacy, free expression, and innovation, and we do that through litigation and policy analysis, as well as grassroots advocacy. I work on, my specialty at EFF is what we call street-level surveillance. These are all of the technologies that are in use domestically on the ground usually by law enforcement or other government officials in local and state government. Local, county, municipal, you name it. I've listed out some of these, but I'm going to really go into a lot of these in detail throughout this presentation. I also want to flag for you the project that we're working on. It's called the Atlas of Surveillance.org. If you're the type of person who needs to multitask during talks like this, I recommend bringing up the Atlas of Surveillance and putting in your local jurisdiction. There are two ways to search through the data. One is to just put in a city, a police department, a state, and it will show you all of the surveillance technologies that we have documented are in use in that area. You can also explore an interactive map we have and look at how technologies are spreading across the country. So you can click, say face recognition, you can see all the places that we've documented face recognition. Now, this map is not complete. It is an ongoing project that we are collecting. Right now, we have data on more than 3,000 police departments and something like 6,500 data points for you to explore. Okay, so let's talk about the growing movement for oversight of surveillance technology. Around the country, municipal agencies and county agencies are passing surveillance oversight ordinances. Now, these kind of come in two different flavors. They're pretty much the same. They just have two different titles. One is CCOPS, the Community Control Over Police Surveillance. Another way to put it is the Surveillance Equipment Regulation Ordinance, or SERO. These are synonymous. It's just that there's different, ways that people describe it depending on what part of the country we're in. But usually these ordinances have a few features. So one is that, oops, sorry, I clicked off my screen there. I'm just going to minimize this. Sorry about this. There is, okay, sorry. So one of the first things you have to do is, in order for a police department to acquire surveillance technology, they need to write a proposed policy in advance and conduct a privacy impact assessment. Then they need to bring that policy and that assessment to an elected body. Usually this is going to be the city council, and there needs to be a hearing in public in a public meeting. Now, the city council has the ability to reject the policy, reject the acquisition of the technology. They can send the police back to the drawing board and say, come up with a policy that protects people's rights a little bit better. But they can also approve it. Now, for technology that is approved, the police have to come back on an annual basis and explain the efficacy, the harms, the cost of the technology. Now, some of these ordinances, particularly the one passed in Oakland, California and San Diego, California, actually does create a civilian oversight body that reviews each of these technologies. Now, this is really growing. Santa Clara County in California was the first a few years ago, but now you're seeing them all over the country, even in places that you might not expect this kind of progress, like Nashville, Tennessee, or Yellow Springs, Ohio. But we are seeing this growing. This is probably coming to a jurisdiction close to you, so definitely keep an eye out for it. What we're also seeing is that these ordinances are often being combined with bans on certain technology, particularly face recognition. And I'll go into depth about face recognition in a bit, but just know that in Portland, Oregon, in Portland, Maine, in Jackson, Mississippi, a lot of places in Massachusetts and California have all banned face recognition. We're also starting to see predictive policing also being banned. In New Orleans, there was a ban on face recognition, predictive policing, and another technology called cell site simulators. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about why we should care about surveillance technology. And I tend to describe the public interest in 5 different categories. So first, the public interest is in preserving freedoms. These are the kind of constitutional freedoms, the freedom of speech, the freedom to organize, the freedom of religion, as well as issues related to freedom of being free from unreasonable search and seizure. In privacy, we're talking about personal information about ourselves that is nobody's business. That might be our medical records, it might be our romantic relationships, just things that are personal to us. When we talk about justice, surveillance technology can impact the justice system. It can result in different kinds of justice. It can result in people being innocent who are pulled into the criminal justice system. We're talking about security. Certainly, some people feel that surveillance gives them an element of security. But I would also highlight that security can also talk about cybersecurity. The data that they're collecting can be breached, and that can put people at risk. And then with all things government and all levels of purchasing and things like that, there's always concerns about waste, fraud, and abuse. Now, whenever an elected body or a oversight body is considering surveillance technology, and sorry, I have like a window here that keeps popping up. Okay. Whenever you're considering a surveillance technology, there are a series of questions that we recommend asking. And if a police department can't answer all of these satisfactorily, then it should be a red flag that something is wrong. So first, when it comes to the technology, asking what data is being collected. Is it video? Is it video and audio? Is it gathering a license plate? Is it gathering biometrics, physical details about us? Number 2, how and where is this data being collected? Where are cameras being placed, and why were those places chosen? Then how long is the data stored, and when is it deleted? And what is the justification for this length of a retention program? If a police department says they're going to keep data for 5 years, why do they need data for 5 years? Now, what are the impacts on vulnerable or targeted communities? We've seen that policing affects different populations differently and often disproportionately, and surveillance technology can exacerbate that. So you really want to ask, have you looked at how this technology is going to affect our Black neighbors? How is it going to affect Muslim people in our community and immigrant populations? And what are we doing to mitigate those harms? Then also, what are the defined purposes for how somebody might use a technology or search a database? Are they allowed to use their surveillance technology for jaywalking, or is it only for violent crime? Really zeroing in on whether there is a proportional use of a technology that is proportional to the crime being investigated. Now, I always ask a police department, how are you measuring the technology's effectiveness? I've seen your press release saying that this is going to reduce murders. How are you going to measure that? How are you keeping track of that to ensure that a year from now, 2 years from now, we can look back at the technology and make a decision, is this technology worth it or not? And we also want to know who in a police department can access the system and the data. And what kind of training do they receive, and who do they get that training from? Is it every member of a police department? Is it sworn officers and civilian personnel? Is it just people in, say, the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force? Who is able to access a data system? And then how are they auditing the system? And by that we mean, how are you checking the system to make sure somebody hasn't misused it or it hasn't been breached? Is there a log? Are you checking it quarterly? Are you checking it annually? And then has the technology or the company that is providing the technology ever experienced a data breach or had somebody without permission access the system? And what did they do in response to that? And then finally, how much does the system cost and how will it be funded? Is it money coming from local businesses? Is it coming out of the general budget? These concerns are actually very important in an age where people are discussing about whether money that is funding police departments should be redirected to other services. Now I want to go over some of the common problems we have with surveillance. Now, this first portion of the talk, I'm still trying to give you that high-level view of why we should care and why this matters. I'm going to segue into each of the individual technologies, and I'm going to highlight these problems later on. So pay attention to these because they're going to come up again later. Now, some of the common problems with surveillance are that, first of all, a lot of these are mass surveillance. They collect information on everyone, regardless of whether you've had any interaction with the criminal justice system or you're suspected of being connected to a crime. Surveillance technology can make errors, particularly if they're using algorithms to make some sort of decision or to recognize some sort of image. And whenever a system can make a mistake, it is going to negatively impact an innocent person, and often in traumatic ways. Now, this technology can result in disproportionate or unequal policing of neighborhoods. This can mean that some neighborhoods are getting better services from police and other neighborhoods are getting worse services from police. This might also even have a racial or socioeconomic impact. This technology can often disproportionately harm communities of color. When we say chilling effects, it means that the existence of surveillance technology may result in people self-censoring or people being afraid to go out and organize or worship. It can even have a chilling effect on the press. Surveillance technology can be used to investigate journalists who are being critical of a police department. Secrecy. I'm sure that everyone here has had some sort of experience with police departments exerting secrecy measures, withholding information. The same goes with surveillance technology. We've seen time and time again that police departments have signed non-disclosure agreements with companies that prevent them from giving public information about a technology. We've even seen district attorneys, or we've seen prosecutors drop cases rather than reveal how they got the evidence through surveillance technology. Surveillance technology can also be abused by bad actors or rogue officials within an agency. It's not uncommon to see police officers probe a database for their own personal gain, or to stalk a loved one, or to stalk a former spouse, or to get, to even gather information and then sell it in exchange for a bribe. And then also, a lot of this technology just costs a ton of money and does not deliver as promised. This may not be a super concern to you, but it is to the journalists I talk to and us as an organization, is that a lot of times there ends up being a relationship between the vendors and the salespeople selling the technology and police. And those relationships can often involve perks and drinks and parties, resulting in technology being purchased because it benefits a company's bottom line rather than what the community needs. There can also be cybersecurity problems. These data systems are very tempting to malicious hackers out there, and we've seen them breached over and over again. One of the students that I mentor at the University of Nevada, Reno's journalism school has compiled a list of more than 250 police departments that have suffered a data breach over the last 10 years. Okay, if there's any questions up right now, I could probably take one. I'm not monitoring the chat, so it would have to be somebody else who brings it to my attention. But if not, I'll just jump into the technologies. I'll just give it like 10 seconds in case there's a question and somebody needs to unmute. All right, I'm going to plod along here. Okay, technologies. Drones. When I started at EFF about 8 years ago, maybe there were about a dozen places with drones. Now there's well over 1,000. We see law enforcement use drones in a lot of different ways, some that are troubling, some that are not. So, for example, they might use a drone to fly over a crime scene or an accident scene after it's happened to just document everything. But they might also use that to surveil protests. They might use it for hostage situations and SWAT operations, or they might use it to enforce building compliance. Or to look for unauthorized marijuana grows. It really is a huge range of use for drones. This is an image from the Atlas Surveillance Project, and a lot of this data comes from the Bard College's Center for the Study of the Drone, and you can see that there are more than 1,000 agencies that we've documented using drones, and these isn't just major metropolitan areas. You often see these in a lot of rural communities as well. And to give you an example of how this technology might be used against people engaged in First Amendment activities, here's a news article about how the Texas Department of Public Safety used drones to surveil protests, and then would take the images from the drones and then circulate them publicly to get anonymous tips about who people, the identity of people who have participated in the protest. And here's an incident where the DPS drone camera was used to identify a Black teenager who allegedly threw a water bottle towards state police. Okay, cell site simulators. You may have heard of these referred to as stingrays or IMSI catchers. Essentially, these are fake cell phone towers that police use to get information from somebody's phone or to track somebody's location. It pretends to be a cell phone, so everybody's phone in the area will connect to that fake cell phone tower, giving them some level of access to the phone's information. The one on the left here in this image is the infamous Stingray that really came to a lot of attention. This used to be something that had to be mounted in a vehicle, like a plane or a truck. But you can see the one on the right here is called a dream catcher from a company called Septier. And now they're small enough that they can even fit in a jacket pocket. Now, we've documented 70 agencies using this technology around the country. I think there are probably a few more, but this is one of those technologies that is often very secret, involves non-disclosure agreements. When I said that prosecutors have dropped cases rather than reveal a technology, this is one of those examples. And so I expect that there are more out there that we haven't documented yet, but it's just a sort of battle to release that information. So to give you an example of how this might be abused, here's a news article from the Capitol News Service in Maryland. And what you have here is, what I've grabbed here is an example. The agencies will tell the public that they need this technology for national security. They need it to stop terrorists. They need to find kidnappers and homicides. But when you actually get into the data and you look at what cases they're using it for, it's something as small as somebody stealing a few chicken wings. And this is a fantastic article if you wanted to Google it and find it online. It is a few years old now, but we are still seeing cell site simulators in use for a whole range of crimes. So I want to talk about biometrics and face recognition, which have been huge in the news in the last year and a half. Now, when we say biometrics, we're talking about physical or behavioral characteristics about you that can be used to identify you. Now, the fingerprint, that is a biometric. It's one we're all very familiar with. Face recognition works very similar in that they take a photo, they map out what they call metadata, the distance between your eyes and your nose and your chin, to create a kind of fingerprint, of a template of your face. And then if they have a photo of somebody else, they will run it against a database in order to find somebody's identity. Now, we have over 370 agencies that we have identified using face recognition. You'll notice that Florida has a whole lot. Florida's really been a pioneer in face recognition. The Pinellas County Sheriff developed a face recognition system and then licensed out to everyone else in the state. That's why you see Florida really covered here. So in practice, how do we see face recognition actually being used? So 3 main uses for police. One is for identity confirmation. So they might use this during a police stop. They might use it at jail booking to confirm that the person is who they say they are. Second is what police call forensic use. So they have evidence, a video of a bank robbery, a photo from social media, and they want to identify the person in the image. That is forensic use. They would use that image and compare it against a face recognition database. And then real-time surveillance involves having face recognition on a camera network where it is tracking people and documenting people in real time. Now, in a physical space, where do we see face recognition? Oftentimes, it'll be on a workstation at the police department. It actually might be an app on a mobile device, like you see here in this image on the right. And again, it might be attached to surveillance cameras. Now, this is one of the technologies that makes mistakes a lot. And when it does, it can really, really harm people. So these are 2 different cases that have come up in Detroit where Black members of the community were misidentified by the technology and pulled into the criminal justice system. We think this is happening a lot across the country, but it's very hard to document because police will not put it in police reports how they identified somebody. They'll just say we ran an image through a database without using the term face recognition, or they'll use a method where they find somebody through face recognition and then they will find an alternative parallel way to find that person, and then they'll put that secondary method in the police report. Body-worn cameras, you are all probably very familiar with this because this is one of the key accountability measures used by civilian oversight to review police interactions. As you know, these became very, very popular during the Obama administration, often because of federal funding that was moving from the Department of Justice to local police departments. However, what we're actually seeing is that these cameras are a mobile surveillance network. They are being used more to prosecute people than they are to enforce accountability. And what we're seeing now is that this camera footage is being either attached to live face recognition or other kind of video analytics, or these video footage is being uploaded to these huge databases which have artificial intelligence combing through the footage. So this is our data so far. We have 1,700 agencies using body-worn cameras. This is super low. It's very hard. I mean, it's a huge trek to document every police department with body-worn cameras, but this is probably one of what we consider one of the most pervasive surveillance technologies around the country. And to give you an example of how this might be used to go after people engaged in protests, last year during the BLM protests, this is a news article from Flagstaff, Arizona. There was no arrests at the protest, but after the protest, in the weeks afterwards, police used that body-worn camera footage to identify people who were there. Then they started arresting people. So automated license plate readers. This is one that I spent an immense amount of time researching and studying. These are cameras that are designed to recognize license plates, and when it sees a license plate, it will take a picture, turn those license plate numbers into machine readable characters and numbers, kind of like text, and then we'll attach the date, time, and GPS coordinates, and then add that to a searchable database. Now, one thing I want to also point out that there are kind of 2 main configurations. One is stationary or fixed cameras. So if you hear police department refer to fixed ALPR or stationary ALPR, it means they're attached to intersections and they catch or light poles or telephone poles. They are capturing all vehicles that pass by. You also have them on police cruisers that are driving around. Sometimes you might even see speed trailers that are pulled into a certain location, and those use the ALPR. But one thing that's very important to know is that even if your police department does not have license plate readers, they can buy access to other people's data. They can subscribe to data collected by private companies or data collected by other law enforcement agencies. So we've got about 820 agencies that we've documented. I think there's probably at least another 500 more that we're in the process of documenting. So here's why ALPR is so dangerous. Let me go over some of the capabilities here. So people can add you to your vehicle to a watch list, and they can get an alert every time your car is seen by a camera. That's almost like tracking you in real time. A police officer who's driving around with a license plate reader on his vehicle will also get alert when he passes somebody on a watch list, and then he can just follow them until they make a signal error or something else, and then pull them over. A police department can put your driver's license, sorry, your license plate, search your license plate and see everywhere your car has been, sometimes going years back. They can put in a location. Maybe that is a marijuana dispensary. Maybe that's a mosque. And they can see all of the vehicles that were seen near that place on a regular basis. They can also map out your network of associates. They can put in your license plate and say, show me vehicles that were seen near this car on a regular basis. Now, let's say a police department wants to track you down. They could say, well, it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Where are we likely to see this license plate at this time of day? Now, I mentioned that people can share license plate data, that you can buy access. We're also seeing that if your police department is collecting license plate reader data, it might be sharing that data with as many as 900 other police departments around the country. Now, we've definitely seen evidence that police in Long Beach have used license plate readers to identify the vehicles of protesters and then have confiscated those cars. We've also seen license plate readers make mistakes, just like with face recognition. Here's one of the most recent egregious examples where a bunch of teenagers were pulled out of their car, handcuffed, because a license plate reader mistook their car for a stolen car. I'll give you an example of these cybersecurity breaches. Customs and Border Protection had a company that did face recognition and license plate readers, and they were breached. And all that data made it onto the dark web. I want to talk about gunshot detection next. A lot of cities are installing networks of sensors. They place basically microphones all around a community that when a loud noise goes off like a gunshot, it gets sent to the police department, alerting them that there might be an active shooter and that they should respond quickly. We have 110 agencies around the country that are using gunshot detection right now, and a lot of them are university police departments as well. But this technology also causes problems. So up top is a news article from Voice of San Diego, in which they analyzed the data from ShotSpotter, and it against San Diego Police Department calls for service, and they found that SDPD officers were being sent to false alarms all the time on a regular basis. And if you imagine if a police officer is responding to something that he thinks is an active shooter, they're going to come in, maybe guns blazing, and it could have been something else. It could have been a car backfiring. It could have been a firework. Down below, there's an article from San Francisco where courtroom testimony showed that an engineer from ShotSpotter had to admit that their claim about the accuracy was made up, totally fabricated by somebody in their marketing department. Now, ShotSpotter also makes a product called a predictive policing product. There's another company called Predpol that is very common as well. And there's kind of two different flavors of predictive policing. One is to identify neighborhoods and, blocks of a community and the time and date that they think crime might happen in order to deploy police to that area. The other version is to identify people that they think might commit crimes, a kind of pre-cog, science fiction kind of concept of identifying either places or people that they think might commit crime. So we have over 150 agencies You'll notice that Tennessee has a lot of predictive policing. That's because IBM worked with the Highway Patrol to develop a predictive policing system for drunk driving and other kinds of car accidents. And all sheriffs in the area have access to that system. This is probably one of the worst cases of predictive policing I've ever seen in my 8 years at EFF. This is the Pasco County Sheriff in Florida. They created an algorithm to rate people about their, give them like a risk level of whether they're going to commit a crime or not. And then they dispatched police officers to basically harass them until they filed a lawsuit or moved away. And they would show up and they would, all hours of the day, in the middle of the night, pounding on the door. They would give them citations if there was a number off on their mailbox. It's a really horrific program that continues to go on to this day. So you might be familiar with surveillance cameras. Most people are used to seeing them in convenience stores and at the bank and just when they're walking about. But I think in most people's minds, these surveillance cameras are going to a VCR somewhere, an old tape deck, and nobody looks at the footage unless a crime happens. Or maybe they think there's some guard sitting in a guard booth, half asleep, as there's this wall of cameras that he's not really watching. That is not how cameras work in 2021. The camera on the left here is a pan-tilt zoom camera. That means there is somewhere in some police department, somebody has the ability with a joystick or a computer key to move that around, to look in all directions, to zoom in. That's why they call it the pan-tilt zoom. The one on the right is a Vigilon camera. You never just see one of these. They usually install dozens of these, and they're all connected, and they go to a computer server that is actually, able to document everything that it sees. And I'll talk a little bit more about that kind of video analytics in a moment. Another sort of thing that's coming up are smart street lights. These are street lights that are often, marketed to police departments marketed to city governments as a way to save money on electricity. But they also come with cameras and gunshot detection and even microphones sometimes. And in San Diego, they found that even though the smart streetlights were ushered in as an energy saving program by the energy, renewable energy department in the city, it actually became a tool primarily used by the police department. And some research by Voice of San Diego found that they used these smart streetlight footage to investigate protesters. Now, City of San Diego did not like this program. The community rose up. The city council decided to shut down the program. But it turned out that the companies couldn't actually shut down the cameras without shutting off the lights themselves. So those cameras are still recording. It's just that the only thing keeping police out of the cameras is, a policy document. Okay, real-time crime centers. This is a trend that we've seen over the last 5 to 10 years. It is police departments will build these high-tech centers that usually have license plate readers, camera networks, gunshot detection, predictive policing, social media monitoring, all of these different technologies feeding into one place. And they will usually have police officers so sworn officers, as well as civilian analysts who are going through and making decisions about where to deploy resources and also to conduct investigations. We have 84 agencies around the country that we've seen install real-time crime centers, and a lot of these are over the last 3 years. This is really the new horizon in policing technology. And once you see this capability where they start consolidating it in one headquarters, that is really going to fundamentally change the philosophy of policing, the style of policing in the police department, moving away from, say, community policing to this kind of remote, sitting on a couch with your mouse sort of policing. And I'm going to give you an example of secrecy with the real-time crime centers. So the Denver Police Department added a whole bunch of cameras, created a real-time crime information center without telling anybody. They didn't tell the city council, they didn't tell the public, they didn't tell the news. The only reason we learned about that is one of the students I work with found a job description for an analyst to be hired to work in this real-time crime center, and we pass that information on to 9 News. Now, a lot of the, I showed you those Avigilon surveillance cameras earlier. A lot of these real-time crime centers use video analytics to analyze all the footage coming into their real-time crime center. And these algorithms can track every object that comes into frame. It can track it from camera to camera. You can click on any object and it will show you over time where that object moved. And that could be a person, it can be a car, it can be a dog, it could be a backpack, it can be a suitcase, it can be anything. And they can also do it to identify people and classify people. So this is a slide that I grabbed from an IBM presentation at a police conference. And it's showing you, as people are exiting a train station, it's identifying people, whether they have glasses, they are bald, and what their skin tone is. If that sounds like it might be very close to racial profiling, I would say it is. So we have identified only 38 places that are using this right now. But this is one of those things that's hard to research for us because the terms are so boring. Video analytics, video algorithms, it's these sort of things that don't jump out at people in public records and don't get the notice of reporters because it is so very boring sounding. It doesn't really jump out like, say, cell site simulators or license plate readers do. We're also seeing police departments set up volunteer registries, the ability for people in the community to say, I have a surveillance camera, I'm going to put it on file with the police department so they can access it later. And you may have also heard about how this is also happening with Amazon Ring cameras. So these are these doorbell cameras that are promoted by Amazon, that allow you to, see who's coming, when somebody's delivering a package to your door. But what Ring is actually doing is they've created an app for people to upload their videos to. And it's kind of a social network for neighborhood watch. And Ring has been going around to now something like 2,000 police and fire departments around the country to get them to join and promote Ring. And they do this through giving police officers discounts, giving police officers free cameras, having parties for police officers. And this is one of the growing trends that we've seen around the country. So here is a map where you can see the thousands of, the gray ones are thousands of Ring partnerships and the blue ones are camera registries. Now, there's a local group here in the Bay Area called Oakland Privacy that did some research of Ring videos that were posted to that neighbor's app. And some of their findings were that 64% of Ring videos that claimed to show suspicious behavior contained people of color. But 43% of Ring videos that claimed to show crime didn't actually show any evidence of crime. So you could see how innocent people, particularly people of color, might be pulled into the criminal justice system because of these Ring partnerships. We also did a report recently where we found that the Los Angeles Police Department had requested footage from Ring users to investigate the protests. Now, these technologies don't exist independently. As you can see with the real-time crime centers, they're being fed into each other. But now we're seeing face recognition on body-worn cameras. We're seeing gunshot detection combined with predictive policing. Here, this image on the right from a police conference I went to is a license plate reader on a drone. One other technology that may or may not be, you may or may consider it surveillance, you may not consider it surveillance, but it's still police technology, is something called the mobile device forensic tool. The major brand of this is a company called Celebrite, but the idea here is that they use these devices to gather data from phones and tablets and computers. It can just basically grab everything off a phone and then analyze it. Now, you might think, well, this is an important technology if you're investigating child pornography. And yeah, that's one of the use cases is investigating child pornography. But we are seeing these used in all ranges of crimes: car crashes, vandalism, graffiti, parole violations. It's not necessarily a proportional use. This quote here is from an organization called Upturn that recently issued a report called Mass Extraction that was looking at the growth of these mobile device forensic tools. So one of the things they point out is that, in most cases, you might need a search warrant to search people's phones. But quite like a huge percent of searches are done with actually people's consent. And so in Harris County, 53% were consent searches or other warrantless search. And in Denver, it was 50%. But the important thing to know is that consent may not feel optional to the person being detained. The person might feel like they're under pressure for the police officers. The police officer might be threatening that if you don't let us search your phone, we're going to have to seize your phone, and then you won't see it for months. And so there's this overwhelming pressure on individuals to hand over their phones to police. So here's Upturn's map. This is now our map. This is one from Upturn, showing the 2,000 agencies that they've documented using these devices. Okay, so that is the overview of the surveillance technology itself. And I can take some quick questions on that if people have questions about particular technologies. The next section is going to be going over, it's going to be a bit of a deep dive in how to investigate these technologies.
Dave, we do have one question for you.
Sure.
Please discuss Cellhawk, Penlink, and or Worcester. We just found out a local law enforcement agency is using Cellhawk. Thank you.
So I've heard of Cellhawk, and Penlink is something that is quite common to be used. I don't want to speak too much about them because I just don't have that information right in front of me. But if I'm not mistaken, these are technologies that are used to analyze the movements of people's phones. It may involve like pen registers. It may involve getting data from cell phone companies and then mapping it out. Whoever asked that question, I'm going to have my email address later on. You can go ahead and email me, and I'll dig out the records that I have about how Cellhawk and Penlink work. And I think Penlink might be, yeah, I can look those up, and then maybe we can talk a little bit offline about what methods there might be to investigate those. Was there any other questions?
That's it for now.
Cool. Okay, the challenge for civilian oversight bodies when it comes to surveillance technology. Now, people usually know when they have been physically, sexually, or verbally abused or unlawfully detained by police. However, people may not know when the abuse is digital. There might be things happening to them where they're getting stopped on a regular basis, or police are coming to their house on a regular basis, or they're just going about their business and suddenly a cop comes out of nowhere and is able to intercept them. This might indicate that there is something going on behind the scenes that they just don't know is going on. If police are grabbing footage from surveillance cameras when they're not supposed to, the average protester, so let me give you an example. I'll talk about this example later, but just because you don't know something is happening to you doesn't make it not an abuse. So I'm going to just sort of go through some of the things and tips for investigating this. So some red flag phrases. If you see police using these keywords, that's something that should make you think, I need to dig into this a little bit deeper. So data-driven policing, intelligence-led policing, predictive policing, threat analysis, real-time criminal intelligence, or when they say, I ran something through a database. All of this may indicate a more in-depth, more problematic network of surveillance in use by a police department. So some of the things that I do, I look for accountability measures in the law, things that have been written into statutes that maybe nobody has looked at in a while that does require some sort of transparency. So for example, in Washington state, the law requires disclosure of the use of cell site simulators and pen traps to the courts. In California, there is a requirement that when agencies ask for cell phone location data, or they go to Facebook and ask for your messages, they have to disclose that to the California Department of Justice, and there's a data set online. And then Maryland law requires a detailed disclosure of automated license plate readers to the legislature each year, including audits. So I'm just going to sort of give you some examples. So for the stuff for California, where It's called an electronic search warrant. So when a police department wants to get your cell phone data or stuff from Facebook, a lot of this information goes to the openjustice.ca.gov website. So when we were going through this open justice data, one of the things we noted in just going through this log, it's just like a big document of like a spreadsheet. And one of the things we noticed in going through it is that the UC Berkeley Police Department put in a search warrant to get the phone numbers, to get a dump from all the cell phone towers around a protest on UC Berkeley campus in order to identify everyone. Now, when we eventually used this to get a copy of the search warrant, and our determination was that this search was not legal, that they did not follow the proper legal procedure to get this kind of data. And it was probably inappropriate to get this kind of data on people engaged in First Amendment activities in the first place. So I want to show you this Maryland stuff, because this Maryland stuff is really interesting to me. So this is a table of the kind of data that has to be disclosed every year in Maryland under state law. And it shows you how many license plates were scanned each year by each of these police departments, how many of those license plates came from fixed license plate readers, and how many of those came from mobile license plate readers. And so these numbers are pretty astounding to begin with. I'm going to actually come back to this in a second because I've got a really cool way to analyze this. Other things, if there's not something in the law, really digging deep into the policies and practices and standard operating procedures of the police department may tell you where you need to look to find information. So oftentimes for technologies, they're going to describe how they can use it, who can use it, how the information is stored and accessed, but importantly, how the use is logged and what kind of audits. I always look for also any reference to some sort of document that they have to create each time. And that might be receiving a form or filling out an agreement. It could be a number of things. Now, if they don't have a policy for a technology, that actually might be evidence of violating the law. So in California, for example, we have a law that says if you're going to use license plate readers, you have to have a policy that protects civil liberties and privacy. It has all of this list, these items that the policy has to address, and that has to be posted online. Now, we were looking at the Sacramento County Department of Human Assistance. This is their food stamp and welfare office in Sacramento County. And they actually have sworn officers who do fraud investigations. And it turned out that 22 employees had access to a license plate reader database and were doing lots of searches, but they did not have a policy on their website. And that was straight up a violation of state law. And as a result, they did shut down this program. In San Bernardino County has a policy for cell site simulators. That is that technology that monitors phones. Under California law, again, you have to have a policy that addresses the use of this technology. Now, in the policy, I noticed that they made reference to an annual report that will talk about the total number of times a cell site simulator was deployed. We got that information. It showed that they had used it 231 times in a year. And we used that information. So cell site simulators are covered by that California law requiring for electronic search warrants. And we were able to use the data from their annual report to connect that to the California Department of Justice data to identify uses of that cell site simulator. And we ended up having to sue San Bernardino because it turned out we believe that they were sealing these search warrants improperly under state law. And so we're currently engaged in litigation on this matter. Misuse. So misuse is going to be really important to oversight bodies. When we talk about misuse, we're talking about whenever a police officer violates the policy to use a surveillance technology or use a database. In California, there's a database called, or it's a computer network system called CLETS, the California Law Enforcement Telecommunications System. Every state has something like this. It usually is, some sort of letter and then ETS. So it might be, NLETS or something like that. But this is the data system. Whenever a police officer pulls you over and they run your driver's license, that is is searching CLETs for criminal history, driver's license information, all that kind of stuff. And we were very interested in finding out how often this stuff is misused. And it turns out in the policy documents that indeed there is a requirement that every law enforcement agency that uses CLETs has to disclose every year how many misuse investigations they opened and what the outcome was. And we were able to, find out that they had this specific form. So we were able to get the data as a spreadsheet, but we were also able to get each individual form for this. And to give you an idea of what this spreadsheet looks like, this is a kind of simplified version of it, but you can see that on the left here is the total number of founded misuse violations. And these are founded by the law enforcement agency's internal affairs, not an oversight body. But you can see that they were quite significant for that year, particularly at Centinela State Prison. But you can also see what happened as a result of it. All 25 violations in Centinela ended up in training. California Highway Patrol had 6, and only 1 person was suspended. This data could be really, really useful for oversight bodies to draw from. Okay, so audits. A lot of these agencies do have to do a regular audit of the use of a surveillance technology. These audits are not always very robust, but they can actually, sometimes they're just a selection of the overall log, but they can be really useful. So I'm going to show you a case example with Annapolis. So this data that you're looking at here is an audit. This was required to be disclosed to the legislature as part of that Maryland law. And so you can see here, like, there's some elements. So it says that they had 589 searches of the database over the course of a year. And so they selected 10% at random and then checked whether everything was documented properly. They didn't check whether it was fully abused or anything like that. They just were checking to see whether the log was accurate, inaccurate, unable to locate, or incomplete. I want you to notice these little red arrows. Every one of these red arrows, it just says incomplete, and then it says note 2. Note 2 says the case number is missing from the log, and the querying officer cannot reproduce it, but certifies that all queries were for legitimate purposes. So in plain language, these were violations of the policy, but the Annapolis PD takes the officer's word for it that these searches were legitimate. There were a couple other notes. So some of the things they looked at were just administrative testing of the system, and then sometimes they didn't have a case number because the request came from an external law enforcement agency. Now, I did some math here. So once we looked at that, there were 59 searches that they reviewed. 19 of them were administrative technical searches. We removed those. Then we took out the 5 that were from external agencies, leaving 35 searches of license plate reader data from the Annapolis Police Department. And then 10 of those 35 were not properly documented. They ended up just taking the officer's word for it. What that means, if 10 of 35, means that we could project that 28.5% of ALPR searches are not adequately documented. That means there were 100 searches in 1 year that did not meet the policy requirements. What does that mean? Don't know. Maybe it's true that the officer just made a mistake and it was proper that they did the search, but it could be very well that the officer is not telling the truth, or the officer did not follow policy along the way. These are kind of areas that oversight bodies can probe. I find that slideshows are particularly useful. And these slideshows can be internal training materials. They can be, a lot of police officers will go give talks at conferences. They might give a presentation before an elected body, and they might be the presentations that academic researchers put together. So here's one we got from San Diego about face recognition. There hasn't been a lot of public discussion of how face recognition had grown in San Diego, but we found this presentation from a conference, and it showed that from 2013 to 2018, the number of face recognition searches grew by 4-fold. That was a staggering amount of face recognition uses. Here's a presentation from the New York Police Department in which they show all the different ways they use face recognition. There's one slide that I have really big on the screen shows how they took an image of somebody and then digitally altered it. They closed the guy's mouth in order to run it against a face recognition data set. Now, one of the things I want to point out here is that a lot of people will ask me, Dave, do you have data on how face recognition is racially biased? And I'll often say, police are not documenting how they're using face recognition based on race. I can't empirically look at a data set and tell you it's racist if they're not actually collecting the data. But what I can tell you is that this presentation that I have that the NYPD gives has something like 25 examples of when they've used face recognition. And all but one of them involves people of color. Almost all of them are Black people. There's one case with a Hispanic individual, and I think there's one case with a white individual. And I think that if you're training police officers to use these technologies in crimes that involve Black people, they are going to go to that technology more and more. I've been able to get vendor manuals from using the public records laws from police departments. Once you get a manual about a piece of technology or a piece of software, you can find out all kinds of information that you can extract and learn about how a police department is using a technology. So for example, I was able to get the manual for automated license plate readers. And once we got that, we discovered that there were two different kinds of documents that you could export from the system very easily. The one on the left, this is like page 1 out of 15. This is showing every agency that they share data with. So this is Sacramento Police Department, and you can see they're sharing all over the country. This is just the letter A's, I don't know why Adams County, Mississippi needs access to data from Sacramento, but they're sharing it nonetheless. The one on the right shows you detections versus hits, the number of license plates they scanned versus the number of license plates that were on a watch list. So essentially, the number of license plates that were part of an active investigation or active public safety interest. And what that means is that a very small number of plates they collect are actually relevant to a public safety matter. So we filed public records requests with we received public records from 173 agencies across the country. Those 173 agencies accounted for 2.5 billion license plate scans. Of those, less than a percent, only about 0.5% were actually relevant to a public safety matter. And yet these were stored often for years, and this data was shared all over the country. Okay, so this is one of the biggest parts that you're going to want to pay attention to. Usage logs. Almost every technology is going to have a log of when people are using it. Now, that's either when they have searched a database, when they've checked it in and out of storage, when they've transferred it to another department. These are going to be very crucial to any investigation. So I'm going to take you back to this. You remember I was talking about the Sacramento County Department of Human Assistance? This is the Welfare and Food Stamps Office. We discovered that they were accessing data because we got one of those data sharing agreements. We found that other agencies were sharing data with them. We were very curious. And so we filed a public records request for the usage log. And sure enough, we were able to get a breakdown of each individual officer and how many license plates they searched over the course of nearly 2 years. That's really important for identifying which police officers might be abusing the system. Not only that, but we were able to get every single information on almost every single search that they ran and every time they accessed the system. Now, these terms like hot list management and hot list browsing and detection browsing, these are all defined in the manual and describe a different kind of search that they were doing or a different kind of action they're doing in the database. Also, that data sharing report is very interesting, and then it also will tell you whether an agency is sharing data with ICE, which is huge in a lot of different jurisdictions, particularly in California. We also found that, so this is from the license plate reader logs from the Long Beach Police Department, in which it showed us that a ICE officer and a Customs and Border Protection officer were given user accounts for the Long Beach Police Department license plate reader system. And in the course of about a year, The CBP officer ran 575 searches of their data, and this ICE officer ran 278 searches of their data. That face recognition system in San Diego, we were able to do the same thing. We were able to find how many face recognition scans were, how many face recognition searches were done by each police department who participated in the program. And you can see there's some very strange information in here, like community college police departments and having access to this data. Now, on the right, you can see that we were also able to get information about each individual officer and how many face recognition searches they ran. So if you had a particular officer who has a history of brutality or racial discrimination, it could be useful to see if they're using face recognition more than other officers. This also is one of my kind of favorite ones here. In California, there is this big, huge vehicle. It's like a big RV that has all of those Celebrite devices for searching phones. And a lot of police departments can't afford their own Celebrite devices, so they can call the cyber response vehicle who will come and show up and extract data. We were actually able to get the travel log for this vehicle. We know how much, where its odometer was at each stop. We know what time it arrived at places. So this can be also interesting information. So we're getting to the sort of portion for questions, and I want to make sure I leave plenty of time. I'm going to do sort of one case study right here. I have a few other that I can go over if we don't have a lot of questions. So while I'm talking about this one, maybe Cameron can gather some questions to ask me. So this is the UC Berkeley Police Chief, Margot Bennett. I saw her speak at a police chiefs conference. On the left, you can see from the app that the talk was about handling extremist events, balancing freedom of speech, peaceful assembly, and public safety. And I went to this because I wanted to know how she was monitoring First Amendment protests. Now, during the talk, she admitted for the first time that they had asked the Alameda County Sheriff's Office to fly drones over their protests. Nobody in the activism community had heard of this before. No one in the police oversight community had heard that they had done this, and none of the protesters on the ground had even seen this. So what we did is we went to Alameda County Sheriff's Office and we asked for their log of drone use, and they gave us this document. And suddenly we were able to match the dates of this log to protests that happened. And we started to notice that the term air support was code for lending the use of their drones to another agency. And so we put in requests for what are called the mission report form. And we knew this existed because of their policies. Their policy said that every time you go out into the field with your drone, you have to fill this mission report form. And so we pulled from the log those dates, asked for these mission reports, and sure enough, they gave us information as well as their justification, in which they start talking about how they are specifically targeting two left-wing groups, Antifa and By Any Means Necessary. They were not seem to be very interested in looking at right-wing protesters, although they do kind of identify that President Trump supporters were going to be the victims of property damage and physical violence. Cameron, do we have any questions?
We do have a few. Let me just.
Okay, I can take a few. Or how are you feeling on time?
Yeah, we're feeling good. Let me get a few of these out to you, and then we'll see where we are for maybe a couple more case studies.
Sure.
So,
all right, so I'm gonna just go back to me, and you can see me again.
Great. So the first one is technologies. The issue is they're used in ways that make for mass surveillance rather than for a specific investigative purpose of a suspect. Is this correct?
That is correct. Some of these technologies are going to be very focused and may have a particular crime they're investigating, but a lot of these technologies do involve the philosophy of gathering information on everyone and then hoping it comes in useful later. That's going to go for license plate readers. That's going to go for face recognition. That's going to go for body-worn cameras and drones. Even with cell site simulators, even though they might be targeting one particular person, they're still gathering information on everyone.
Okay. The next one we have is, can law enforcement officers access and manipulate personal computers directly? If so, by what technologies?
So this is something we don't necessarily know that much about. One of the things that we have seen is something called a NIT, a network intrusion technique. It's very much by design to make it sound very boring. Network intrusion technique. What does that mean? But there were a series of cases related to the website Playpen, which was known for being a dark web file sharing website for child pornography. What law enforcement did at that stage is that they inserted some code into the website. So they were able to somehow take over part of Playpen, insert this code so that when people went to the website, it hijacked their computer. So that's one of the capabilities that we've seen. Outside the United States, certainly law enforcement will buy technology that can remotely hack people's phones and computers. We don't see that so much domestically in the United States, in part just because we have a much stronger constitution than in a lot of other countries.
Thanks for that, Dave. Just a couple more. Is there a singular place to find out what technologies your agency is using?
Oh, yes. The best resource is the one that we've been building for this exact purpose. So there doesn't exist really one particular website for this. And so about 2 years ago, we decided to build that website. So the atlassurveillance.org is the largest database of its kind that that will show that will show what we've gathered from various data sources, from our own research. That's one avenue. I'm gonna just sort of this is actually a nice little segue here. So procurement purchasing records are probably one of the things that we turn to the most. It can be, police can often hide the use of a technology, but it's hard for them to hide the acquisition of the technology. You might remember that TV show on HBO, The Wire, and there's this adage in The Wire that if you follow the drugs, it'll just lead you to drug dealers, but if you follow the money, you never know where it's going to lead. Following the money is probably one of the best ways to figure out what police department are using or not. So if your government agency has a procurement portal or a budgeting portal, you might be able to find out what technology they use through that. We purchase access to a website called GovSpend, which GovSpend files public records requests across the country to get those procurement records, and we'll often search through those procurement records for a particular technology in a particular place. Sorry, what about any other questions?
Well, there is one about, hold on, let me pull this back out again. Actually, we do have a few more that popped up while you were answering that one. One of our attendees has asked about, what about fusion centers, and can you please discuss parallel construction?
Sure. So fusion centers are very similar to real-time crime centers. They often have access to all sorts of data sources and cameras and things like that. However, real-time crime centers are usually operated by a municipal or a county level law enforcement agency and focus on the whole range of crimes that police usually work on. Fusion centers are actually part of a nationwide network. They are usually operated by state or regional entities. They are part of a network funded and managed by the Department of Homeland Security, but they are supposed to focus on threats to national security. They're supposed to focus on threats to large events. They are not necessarily supposed to be focusing on low-level crimes. Around the country, I think there are 79 of these fusion centers. They also have this mission of making sure that data is flowing between agencies, that there's a way for information from the federal government to make it to the locals and vice versa. Now, what we've actually seen is that these fusion centers really tend to just focus on like a very small number of crimes. They'll often accept things called suspicious activity reports, which are allowing regular members of the public to submit tips when they think they see somebody suspicious around a water treatment facility or something like that. What we've seen over the last few years, though, is that they have become very, very focused on activist movements. So there was a big data breach called Blue Leaks last year, in which data from a whole bunch of fusion centers was accessed and dumped online. And journalists have gone through this data, and they found that time and time again, there are these intelligence bulletins being generated from these fusion centers that are really focusing on the Black Lives Matter movement, on Antifa, and sometimes on right-wing movements, but it's definitely skews very much towards left-wing movements. But a lot of it is just intelligence gathering, and we don't necessarily see them always that directly involved in criminal investigations, mostly because we see that their local partners are the ones carrying out the prosecutions. And then parallel construction. So parallel construction is a term for hiding the method that you used by making up another way that you could have gotten the information. This infamously came to life over a program called Hemisphere. Now, Hemisphere is a partnership between AT&T and law enforcement, in which AT&T can search its data to find people's phones and information about people's phones. And in order to hide the use of this, law enforcement was instructed to do something called parallel construction. So say they got somebody's phone number when that person switched to a burner phone. They don't want to reveal they used Hemisphere, so they might come up with some other thing, like now that they have that information, maybe they can track it somewhere else and say, well, we got this information through other means. That's what parallel construction means.
Thank you. If you don't mind, we've got a few more here. Nashville's Metro Council is debating removing the ban on fixed ALPRs with the desire to be a crime-solving tool. Are there any good examples of municipal policy that is a good framework to emphasize, since it seems that a bill of some variety will pass?
So, I mean, what I would say is that the devil's in the details. I mean, I don't really think this technology is particularly useful in the end. I mean, versus other forms of policing. But the question is, how long are they holding on? First of all, a couple of questions. Where are they installing the cameras? Is it equitable? Is it distributed evenly? Is it benefiting businesses? Is it harming Black communities? That's one of the big questions, is about where they're placing the cameras. But the other thing is, how long are they retaining the data? I would argue that it is just as effective to hold on to the data for 24 hours than holding it onto it for a year. If you're doing it for 24 hours, a crime happens, you know where the data's coming, you can grab it, you can save it, and then everybody else has their data deleted. And I think that's a really important consideration, is ensuring that the data is not kept longer than they actually need for it. But, I would just caution the city government that this information is collected on them too. What this means is a police officer can look up where city council members are traveling, and when they're going to work, and when they're coming home, and if they're going out in the middle of the night. That is what has happened. I mean, that they have that ability. And it's happened in the past that we've seen police officers who, are, say, having a union beef with certain city council members, using surveillance equipment to try to investigate and undermine them.
So next, what are some examples of cities' responses to the 250 data breaches that police departments experienced in the last decade?
So I wish we could say that they're better, but they're not. I think a lot of police departments and cities are dazzled by this new technology, but don't want to put in the investment into hiring a cybersecurity professional on staff who can make sure everything's locked down. They just think that if you buy it once, that's it. And so that can be a real problem if they're not continually investing and realizing that hackers out there are getting more and more sophisticated, and they're going to come in and they're going to hack stuff. During the 2017 inauguration, the Metropolitan Police Department, right before the inauguration, had all of its cameras taken over by some Eastern European hackers. That's in the Metropolitan Police Department. That isn't your small town, middle of Utah police department. That's one of the most sophisticated police departments in the country. One positive example that I can possibly give comes from the New Orleans area. A few years ago, a colleague and I found that a whole bunch of fixed license plate reader cameras were left on the internet. No password, nothing. You could go to your browser and you could actually open up the camera in your browser, mess with the controls. We didn't mess with the controls. We just saw that you could mess with them. But you could actually open up the camera and see it live, and you could siphon off the data. We did contact 3 different agencies. We contacted a whole bunch of agencies, and all the ones in Louisiana did fix those cameras. We found some cameras in University of Southern California's campus. They fixed those. But in Hialeah, Florida, they didn't even respond to our communications. They didn't even seem to care that they had a camera like sitting online unlocked.
Thanks for that, Dave. So next, so I apologize. I'm going to need to reword this because I think there were a few words missing in the thing. So for the person who posted this, please let me know if I'm missing your point here. So how do you avoid seeming like you're on a fishing expedition when you're filing public requests and the responses that you're getting are not showing anything out of the ordinary, but resources such as EFF, the Bard Center are showing that this technology may exist in the city?
So, sorry, I'm not sure I'm following as well. So what you're saying is when a police department says they don't have the technology and our data is showing they do?
I think that that's what they're asking, yes.
Sure. So this is one of the things that frustrates me greatly. I can think of at least like a dozen occasions where a police department is, I will file a public records request for a technology, and they will say, no, we don't have that technology. And then I show them a document from either their own website or from another agency, and I'm saying, this document says you have that technology. They go check again, and they come back, and they're like, oh, yeah, we do. And it's usually because whoever is administrating the records thing doesn't know where to look or didn't use the right terms, or there's just not enough communication in the police department. I think one of the misconceptions here about surveillance technology is that it's always being adopted by up high. The chief is signing up on this. Well, what's actually happening is a police officer might go to a training session on automated license plate readers, and the vendor will give them a free account for license plate readers and a free account for face recognition, and it never even makes it up to the policymaking level. If you've read any of the news articles about Clearview, which is an AI face recognition app, that was just given out, wholesale to low-level police officers around the country. And half the time, police, when reporters were asking police departments about this, like, did you know you had this? They're like, no, we didn't. We're going to have a talk with our lower level officials about this. So, I mean, I wish I had a better better answer for you on how to push back. Certainly, if it's an error in our system, like we have something from 2017 and they stopped using the technology, well, we're happy to fix it. But it's hard because we don't know when an agency stops using technology. They don't put out a press release saying we stopped using something. They only put out press releases when they start using something.
Okay, and then our last one that we have in the queue as of now is, can the federal government, especially related to civil rights, control the use of these technologies, or is this more of a local issue?
It's both. I think there's some congressional legislation to rein in certain technologies, but I mean, it just kind of depends on how much confidence you have in Congress to pass laws. I don't have enough patience for Congress. They move too slowly and they talk a lot, but things don't get done. And so we see more happening on the municipal level and on the state level. So that's what I would say. I would say that, we have seen the U.S. Department of Justice get involved in surveillance abuse. One example that comes to mind is the Calexico Police Department. A few years ago, police were abusing technology there, and they came in at the request of the Calexico police chief and did an investigation and came up with recommendations. Cool.
Okay.
All right. Well, I've got some cool stuff that I want to show you before I log off, and you can just jump in if there are more questions.
Okay.
Okay. So this is a really cool one. Geographical data sets. In some jurisdictions, you might be able to get data on where surveillance cameras are located or where surveillance data has been collected. So, for example, we were able to get data from Oakland back in 2014 about where we asked for 7 days of where they collected license plates. And we were able to map that out over census data and it did indicate that license plate readers were being used predominantly in Black communities in Oakland. The same thing happened in Buffalo, where they had noticed that that more license plate readers were being scanned in certain parts of town. Now, the reporter here is saying one part of town, a certain part of town. When I asked the reporter what he meant by that, he was like, well, this was a euphemism for the Black part of town, that we were noticing about it was targeting one area versus another. And the Buffalo Council president was very, very concerned about that. We were also able to get data about where private surveillance cameras are located. So this is a data set that we acquired through the Public Records Act from the San Francisco District Attorney's Office. Sometimes you can just find them online. So Denver has all of its cameras just posted on their website. And this is one of the ones that just blows my mind. So in Newark, they actually have something called the Citizen Virtual Patrol, where you can open up all of the cameras and just watch them in HD on your browser whenever you want. Now, why would you want this stuff? Well, you can map it over census data. You can do all sorts of stuff. So here is something about a news article about the St. Louis Real-Time Crime Center. And what they noticed is that, while this, people in the community in St. Louis were concerned about the rising murder rate, and maybe police were saying that their camera network was meant to address the murder rate, what actually happened is that the camera network was funded and promoted by businesses. And so these cameras ended up being put near where businesses are, not where actual violent crime was happening. And so their conclusion, having analyzed this, is that this has resulted in a disparity where businesses are getting better police service than Black communities are in St. Louis. I'm going to give you, I think this might be my last case study of how we at EFF uncovered abuse in San Francisco using our ordinance that regulates surveillance technology. So back in 2019, there was a news article about how a bunch of business districts, so these are special districts that can collect taxes on property to give services, but they're run by a nonprofit and they are separate from the city and the county of San Francisco. But we'd heard that there were a whole bunch of surveillance cameras being placed around the city, and they were being funded by this wealthy cryptocurrency billionaire. But these business districts are subject to the California Public Records Act because they collect taxes. And so when we discovered you were able to use the Public Records Act to get information, in 2019 we asked for their policies on how they use the cameras and how people can access the cameras. We asked for the location and map of all the cameras. We wanted to know what the forms look like when the police request footage from the camera network. And we wanted the log of all footage requests that they had received. And sure enough, we were able to get some cool stuff. Like, they didn't give us a copy of the map, but they took a photo of the map on the wall showing us in the Union Square area, what the coverage looked like. But they also gave us a list of the names of the cameras, which told us where they were located. Now, when the protests started happening in 2020 during the summer, we were very curious about what was going on with these cameras and whether police were accessing them. And sure enough, we got copies of emails, we got copies of video request retrieval forms, we got the log, and what we found is that San Francisco Police Department had asked for live remote access to these cameras. They wanted to be able to view protests live through these cameras. They also asked for all video footage from these cameras over a period of time, just what they called a big data dump. Now, in San Francisco, we have an ordinance that says police officers cannot use new technologies without writing a policy and having it approved by the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. This, to us, was a clear violation of the law. And it wasn't just a violation to us. So Supervisor Aaron Peskin actually wrote the ordinance and immediately started tweeting about it and saying, this is exactly the sort of thing that our ordinance was meant to prevent. And he started taking action on the municipal level. The San Francisco Police Commission started investigating into it. And then we also have filed a lawsuit on behalf of protesters for them violating this law. And I have some resources that I can sort of share in the chat, I think. or at least I can try. But I believe that is the end of my very long slideshow. But I want to put in my contact materials as well. But I'm going to give you, I think this is the chat here. So 1 second, I'm going to grab these. Okay, so if you want to see what these ordinances look like and what the advisory boards look like, I've provided one for the Oakland Privacy Commission. You can see what their meetings look like. You can see what kind of policies they provide. In Seattle, you can see what kind of privacy impact assessments the Seattle Police Department has released. And the New York Police Department just issued all of its summaries of the technologies as well. I'm not sure that theirs are, like, we have some issues with how they've done it, but it still is of interest. I'm also going to put my contact information in this. EFF is, myself and my colleagues are always willing to talk, and we can do testimony, we can advise you. That's a resource we provide. So my email is dm@eff.org, or you can send speaking requests to info@eff.org. Boom. Okay, Cameron, have more questions come in?
No, we have not had any more, but even if we had, we've run out of time. So
okay.
But I did want to thank you, sincerely thank you for spending the time today and sharing all of this knowledge with the Oversight community. I also want to thank everyone who was in attendance for taking time every day to learn more about civilian oversight of police surveillance technology. So I think all of us have walked away with a lot more information, and I know I myself with a lot of information about how much I didn't know. So thank you.
And if anybody has anything interesting come up in their oversight bodies, like interesting cases, we're always looking for examples of where this technology was abused, so we can learn from it and we can see what happens elsewhere. So always feel free to watch it. Like never hesitate to reach out.
Great. Thanks, Dave. And so for everybody else, just to let you know, the webinar series really has just begun this year. Registration is still open for our March 4th webinar, which will explore death anxiety and police culture. In addition, make sure to watch your inboxes, as we'll be shortly opening registration for our April, May, and June events that will take on the topics of providing oversight of protest policing, truth and reconciliation, and the role of surveillance in organizational change. The role of supervisors in organizational change. It's been a pleasure being with all of you today, and I look forward to seeing you at our next event. Thank you.